December 17th, 1942, 08:14 in the morning. Somewhere over the frozen, churning cloudscape of northern France, the temperature at 20,000 feet is 40 degrees below zero. The air inside the B-17 Flying Fortress, known to its crew as Heavens Above, is a paradoxical mix of roasting ozone from the sun glaring through the plexiglass nose and a biting, lethal cold that creeps in through 1,000 cracks in the aluminum skin. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines is a physical substance, a deafening vibration that gets inside a man's teeth and bones. Staff Sergeant David E. King, a 20-year-old waist gunner from a quiet street in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, squints into the endless, blinding white, his breath forming a frozen cloud inside his oxygen mask. His gloved hands, clumsy as boxing gloves, rest on the breech of his .50 caliber machine gun. The exposed skin around his eyes stings with the first bite of frostbite. He is not thinking about the German fighters that intelligence promised would be swarming. He is not thinking about the black flowers of flak that will soon bloom from the ground ahead. He is thinking about a number. The number is 8. It is his 8th mission, 17 more, and he can go home. If he can survive 17 more walks through a sky made of fire and steel, he will earn the most precious currency in the 8th Air Force, a ticket back to the world of the living. He has watched as men who were one mission shy of that magic number simply failed to return, their bunks silently stripped, their letters home left unsent. He does not yet know that the very math he clings to for hope is a sentence of almost certain doom. He does not know that the statisticians and commanders who set the number 25 have calculated something more chilling than any flak burst. They have calculated the precise point at which a man's luck runs out, and they have built a system upon that terrible calculation. Within 4 months, David King's war will be over, one way or another, defined entirely by an invisible threshold that turns survival into a cold, hard equation. To understand the profound anxiety that gripped the heart of an American bomber crewman, one must first understand the revolutionary and horrifyingly dangerous doctrine they were tasked to execute. The United States entered the war committed to a theory of strategic bombing that was, in 1942, little more than an act of faith. This was precision daylight bombing. While the British Royal Air Force, scarred by their own unsustainable losses early in the war, had turned to the cover of night for area bombing of cities, the Americans insisted they could destroy the German war machine by striking specific industrial targets, ball-bearing plants, aircraft, factories, oil refineries, in broad daylight. The theory was that the legendary Norden bomb site would allow a bombardier to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles high. This policy, according to declassified military planning documents from the Army Air Forces, was rooted in a deep-seated belief in the self-defending bomber. The B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with a dozen .50 caliber machine guns, was meant to fight its way to the target and back in a tight, mutually supporting combat box formation, a wall of lead that no fighter pilot would dare challenge. This theory would crash into reality with devastating consequences. The Luftwaffe, defending its homeland, was a ferocious and adaptive enemy. They quickly learned to attack the formations head-on, the closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, giving their cannons time for only a terrifying 2-second burst of 20 mm shells before they peeled away. According to historian Donald L. Miller, author of Masters of the Air, a crewman's life expectancy in the air war over Europe was dramatically shorter than that of an infantryman in the ground war. The sky was not a battlefield, it was an arena of statistical elimination. It was into this arena that the policy of a finite tour of duty was introduced, a policy that transformed the psychological reality of the air war. The number wasn't arbitrary. It was 25. The origins of this specific figure lie in a brutal calculus of morale, medicine, and simple mathematics. Early in the war, there was no fixed tour. Men flew until they were killed, wounded, captured, or suffered what was then called combat fatigue, a polite term for a soul shattered beyond repair. Command was faced with an air force of ghosts, men with the 1,000-yard stare who could no longer function. A system was needed to make the unbearable feel temporary, to offer a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. The Army Air Force's aviation medicine experts and operations analysts, examining loss rates and psychological breakdown patterns, determined that the greatest combat effectiveness curve existed before the 15-mission mark, with a steep and irreversible decline thereafter. They expected a crew to take 50% casualties before completing a tour. To fly 25 missions was to complete a full cycle of probability, a lap around a track where 1 and 2 runners would never see the finish line. The men in the leather flight jackets knew this math intimately. They watched the empty cots multiply. They saw replacement crews arrive, full of bravado, and become the old, hollow-eyed men of the squadron within 3 weeks. The number 25 became a psychological lifeline and a mathematical death trap. It was the promise that their sacrifice was not infinite, a contract with fate that if a man could just cheat the odds long enough, the system would let him go. But those who enforced the contract, the generals and colonels, also knew a terrible secret. For a horrifying period of the war, it was statistically almost impossible for a crew to actually reach that goal. The men who entered this machine had been told a story about the enemy. They had been told the Luftwaffe was a diminished force, that German industry was on its knees. They expected to find a weakened, faltering foe. Instead, they encountered a wall of apocalyptic violence. The Flak, short for Fliegerbeherkanone, was not just a danger. It was a psychological weapon. Unlike a fighter, which you could shoot back at, the Flak was faceless, a sinister, impersonal force. The air would turn black with puffs of smoke the size of a man's torso, the sound of the detonations a metallic crump over the engine noise, followed by the sound of shrapnel hitting the plane. Not a rattle, but a sound like a giant throwing a handful of gravel through a tin shed. Their mental image of a clean mechanical war disappeared in the first 5 seconds of a flak barrage. What they found inside their own aircraft was a horror no briefing officer had ever described. At 40 below zero, if a man removed his glove to clear a jam gun, the skin would freeze to the bare metal in an instant. The clear saliva in the oxygen mask tubing could freeze into a solid plug, suffocating a man from his own breath. The sight of a comrade's blood freezing into a burgundy slush before it could even pool on the deck of the fuselage was an image that rewrote the very definition of war for the farm boys and factory workers who witnessed it. The first sign that something was wrong with everything they believed about this war was not the enemy, but the environment itself, a battleground so indifferent to human life that the very air wanted them dead. This dissonance between expectation and reality is preserved in the words of the men who lived it. Document after document from this period reveals a profound psychological schism. Lieutenant Jack Mathis, a bombardier who would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, had written to his family about the glory of high-altitude flight. The reality he found over the target at Vegisac was a mortal wound from a flak burst, a bomb bay full of smoke, and the superhuman act of dropping his bombs while bleeding to death on the bomb site sighting mechanism. Yet this was not the greatest psychological weight. The true burden was the accumulation of days. Consider the logbook of Staff Sergeant John P. Jack Mallory, a radio operator from Ohio. His first 10 missions were logged with a precise, optimistic script. By mission 16, the handwriting alters. It becomes shakier, more compressed. This physical artifact charts the erosion of a man's nervous system. The men developed superstitious rituals that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with psychological survival. The same pair of unwashed long underwear, a specific order of entering the plane, a charm placed on the instrument panel. They were not fighting Germany anymore. They were fighting the law of averages. Every mission became a single turn of the roulette wheel. They knew that a staggering 77% of bomber crews would be lost before completing their entire tour. A statistic the Stars and Stripes never printed, but the men calculated in their heads every single night. The number 25 was no longer a goal. It was a taunt. And then something shifted. The very symbol of their impossible mission began to represent something else, something so mundane that it saved their lives. That symbol was a can of food. In the early days, survival was a matter of spiritual endurance. But slowly the equation began to change not because of bombers, but because of another machine entirely, the P-51 Mustang. The introduction of a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back was the material manifestation of American industrial logic. The Luftwaffe pilots, far from the faceless horde the crewmen had imagined, were now facing their own psychological breaking point. They had been told to expect waves of unescorted bombers that would eventually tire and turn back. Instead, by the spring of 1944, they encountered a roof of glinting silver aircraft so vast it blocked out the sun, protected by fighters that sought them out with predatory patience. The records of the German General Staff, now held in the National Archives, reveal a crisis of attrition the Americans never fully understood at the time. They were losing irreplaceable veteran pilots faster than they could train new ones. The Allied crews, armed with the promise of going home after 25 missions, were flying with a desperate end-goal focus. The Luftwaffe pilot had no such number. He would fly until he died. This is the moral complexity at the heart of the statistical equation. To get an American crewman to his 25th mission, to hand him that ticket home, the system had to create a factory of death that broke the German pilot corps. The survival of one was the almost certain death of the other. The bomber crews may not have known the name of the German ace finally shot down by a P-51. But that act of violence was the invisible checkmark in the ledger that allowed David King's crew to limp home with 2 engines on fire. The abundance of American industry, the ability to build a P-51 with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, cram it with American fuel, and fly it on American time, was the reality that won the war of the 25th mission. It wasn't a matter of courage. Both sides had that in terrifying quantities. It was a matter of time management. Years later, Staff Sergeant David King would sit on his porch in Cedar Rapids. He would talk little about the flak or the fighters. Instead, he would describe a strange, specific ritual from his final 25th mission. When the wheels of heavens above touched the tarmac in England after a grueling Berlin raid, the rule was for the ground chief to simply mark the plane as returned. But the flight surgeon came aboard. He carried not medical instruments, but a single, small glass of medicinal whiskey. This was the unspoken ceremony. 1 shot of whiskey for a full tour. King later wrote in a letter found after his death, "The thing I remember most was that the shot glass was perfectly clean. In the middle of war and filth and oil, someone had made sure that glass was spotless. That tiny gesture of civilization, a clean glass to mark the end of a savage probability curve, was the moment the war ended for him." This is what the 25 mission tour ultimately teaches us. It reveals a hard, pragmatic truth about the human soul under maximum pressure. The men were not superhuman. They were simply placed in a system that understood their breaking point. The number 25 was a calculated equation that acknowledged a man could only watch his friends spiral down in flaming coffins so many times before he became a machine himself. The War in the Sky was not a heroic epic. It was a factory. A factory of attrition where the product was not just bomb damage, but survival. The men who came home, the ones who drank that symbolic whiskey, were the output of a massive, impersonal industrial process that had finally outproduced the enemy. In the end, the greatest weapon the bomber crews had was not the Norden bomb sight or the 50 caliber machine gun. It was the permission to believe in an after. A promise, etched in a military order, that their luck didn't have to hold forever. It only had to hold for 25. And for those who saw the number 25 written in chalk on the nose of a bomber, it wasn't a countdown to death. It was the first number they had ever seen attached to the rest of their lives.